Okay, you are with Mr. Price in room C5. We're going to go over 18-3, which deals with the taxonomy and classification of organisms. The first thing that I want to point out to you is that right off the bat, you see Carlos Linnaeus's 7 taxons are here in reverse order: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And then if you see right here, we've added one. And we've added one because it doesn't really, if we start looking at this on an evolutionary relationship, it doesn't count for the first couple billion years, in fact, of how life evolved. And what we've done is we've added this. So I'm going to kind of go through the history here quickly. In the 1990s, what we had were just a couple more kingdoms. And to account for those, we tried to talk about eubacteria. So that's a bacteria that you know. Archaeobacteria, which is the extreme or the X Games bacteria. They tend not to live in the presence of oxygen and live in like really hot places, like in hot pools and like Yellowstone National Park and things like that, where you wouldn't expect life to be. Then there's Protista, I will also call this Protus. Then you have your fungus, your plants, and your animals. But what has happened is, if you look at this cladistic analysis of all forms of life, it didn't really take into account, first of all, the differences just between prokaryotic cells and therefore eukaryotic cells. So if you look at everything over here, these are eukaryotic organisms, and we give that domain over here in yellow the classification of eukarya, and then we go into plants, animals over here, fungus, and then protists. So to get us started is that these groups have not been really talked about and how long they've been evolving. If you just look at kingdoms, that could be brought back into, depending on who you talk to, in the last couple millions of years. Mammals in the last 65 million years have been kind of the dominant kingdom. So again, there are 3 domains, and those 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And what they do is they represent what is the differences in just basic cell structures. And we're going to go through each of those cell structures here momentarily. So again, these 4 kingdoms right here, protists, plants, fungus, and animals, all are underneath the domain eukarya. Archaeobacteria is underneath domain archaea, and then you got bacteria domain, which has eubacteria as a kingdom. So again, here's a little bigger or better representation of that. So you can see these 4 here as I'm moving the pointer around. You've got 4 different kingdoms underneath eukaryotic cells, basically. You got one type of prokaryotic cell called archaea, and the only kingdom underneath archaea is archaeobacteria. And then you got the domain bacteria, which has only the kingdom eubacteria underneath of it. So some of the things. The first thing we're going to talk about is the domain bacteria, and this is the common bacteria that most of us think about, like strep throat and E. coli and things like that. Again, as I said before, bacteria only includes the kingdom eubacteria, and what we're looking for when we find new organisms is, if you're looking at this from a dichotomous key perspective, is what is the first question we ask when we find new cells? Well, one of the first questions we ask is it a prokaryotic cell? Well, then it's got to go into the domain bacteria or into the domain eukarya. And then the next step is, well, what kind of prokaryotic cell? If it has this stuff called peptidoglycan in its cell wall, we will label it underneath this domain called bacteria. And peptidoglycan, if you look right here, this is the monomer of it. And you'll notice that it kind of forms this shape that comes from a glucose molecule, and then it's got these tails, if you will, of amino acids, and that gives it a little bit different identification. So peptidoglycan is this monomer that makes up or is found in the cell walls of bacteria. And again, some of the examples that I'm going to come up with is E. coli and strep, basically. The next one is, and I throw this all at you right at once, is the domain archaea, which has only the kingdom Archaeobacteria underneath of it. These are, I like to call them the X game of bacteria. They live in the most extreme environments, and I'm going to say in the universe, because there have been some findings that these are the possible types of cells that could have been brought here by comets when the Earth was just starting to cool. And what we're looking for when we separate these two types of prokaryotic cells, bacteria and archaea bacteria, is archaea bacteria does not have that peptidoglycan. So again, in that dichotomous key mode that we were talking about here in class, is that it's either does or does not. And in this case, bacteria has peptidoglycan and archaea bacteria does not have peptidoglycan. And again, they're the extremists. They live in volcanoes and hot springs, and the Great Salt Lake actually has them because of their completely so much salt in the Great Salt Lake that only these extreme bacteria can survive and do well and thrive in that type of harsh environment. And the other cool thing about archaea bacteria and the domain archaea is that they live for the most part without oxygen present. And if you remember back to early Earth did not have oxygen present. So it's one of the hypotheses proposed right now that some of the early life forms were these archaea bacteria. And then when we jump into what we're more familiar with, if we go and say that this new organism that we found in our dichotomous key when we find new species has eukaryotic cells, we'll start classifying it then according to one of the next four kingdoms, which is kingdom Protista and plants, fungus, and animals. So again, all of these kingdoms have eukaryotic cells, meaning they have a nucleus and organized organelles and cell structures that we talked about last semester in chapter 3. So again, all the members of the domain eukarya have cells with a nucleus. For the most part, there's some differences between the cell organelles and some of their cell structures, but they are eukaryotic cells and they share a common ancestor according to that first cladistic analysis I showed you. So one of the derived characteristics that separates them is that they have a nucleus. The kingdom Protista, I think as you guys take off and go into college and stuff, I think they're going to divide this into a couple different kingdoms. It's kind of been hard to, it's kind of the catch-all for single cell organisms that are eukaryotic and for other organisms that are underneath this too but are not single cell. So I think that in the next few years you'll see a single cell protist and then you'll see another kingdom arise underneath the domain eukarya. That's going to define a little bit better what examples are. Some of the things that we have looked at in this classroom are parameciums. There's that football-shaped looking organism. They have cilia around them that helps them move. Spirogyra, which is this guy right here, is another type of protist. You got my favorite, the amoeba. It's just a blob that moves around and forms any shape. And then you got the volvox, which is right here. Notice that this is green, so it's got some chlorophyll in it. Should remember that back from when we were talking about photosynthesis. So again, Spirogyra, this is green too. Again, it's got some chlorophyll in it. Amoeba is more animal-like, so no real structure to its cell. Paramecium, again, that was that cilia I was talking about. Again, we're in the kingdom Protista or Protus, and we're talking about the domain Eukarya. Volvox, again, is an organism that has some chlorophyll in it. So the next kingdom underneath Eukarya is what you see as fungus. And there's all kinds of different fungus. Most of us think about mushrooms. Athlete's foot is a type of fungus. And these are all heterotrophic. So what I want to point out to you is that these heterotrophic organisms secrete digestive enzymes to digest their food outside their body. And how I put it to you is that basically a fungus throws up and licks the fungus, or licks up their the stuff around them and reabsorbs it back into their digestive tract. So they digest outside their body and then they reabsorb what was digested around them. The thing that we look for in fungus, and this is what separates them from plants because they also have a cell wall, but there's this stuff called, I call it chitin, some people call it chitin. Either way, to me, is fine. You see this glucose kind of molecule going on here. This is what chitin is, or chitin, and this is the molecular structure of it, and it's found in all of these forms of fungus. And again, some of the examples are fungus, mushrooms, yeast, and most molds that you have. So if you ever see something black growing up your wall in your house, you've got kind of a black fungus growing up that wall, and it's digesting outside of its body, your wall, basically trying to survive. This is kind of cool. Shelf fungus, red mushroom, just like the names because they're pretty simplistic. You got your bread mold, some of you might have that growing in your refrigerator right now, and then you got cup fungus. If you were to hold this up, I'm sure on a side view you would see that it looks like a cup. So again, the next one of my favorite movies is Star Wars, and you'll see that those redwood trees, this is a picture from that, and they have a cell wall that helps support them. And a lot of times you see plants as photosynthetic and contain chlorophyll molecules and chloroplasts at some point. What separates, again, plants are that chlorophyll, and they're in the kingdom Planta underneath the eukaryotic cells, and they distinguish in part because they have cell walls that surround their cell membrane. And again, there's a whole all kinds of different types of plants. During the dinosaur times, before 65 million years ago, ferns were some of the most dominant plants. They tend not to be as much now, but at that time they were the dominant plant. And then we're going to jump into a eukarya domain, into the kingdom Animalia, which most of us are familiar with. The main points I want to quickly point out to you about these is that all members of Animalia, or the animal kingdom, are multicellular, and they're heterotrophic, meaning they must go out and ingest food or get food and bring it in. So that's where your herbivore, omnivore, carnivore, and detrivore comes in on how they get their food. And the other interesting about the animal kingdom is that they do not have cell walls. So this really allows for these creatures to be mobile and to move around. And remember that all animals contain a protein sequence that makes the muscle fibers myosin. So again, just some different things, kind of like that scorpion. Canis lupus here, the wolf. Remember, all dogs came about 30,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago from Canis lupus. And then just as a review, so living things, what we're looking at are two divisions here. We got a prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cells. And because of their cell wall structures, that peptidoglycan will put them into one of two domains underneath prokaryotic cells. With peptidoglycan, we'll move it into the domain bacteria. Without peptidoglycan, we'll move it into the domain archaea. And again, the kingdom underneath bacteria is eubacteria. The kingdom underneath the domain archaea only for now is the kingdom Archaeobacteria. Then we move over to the eukaryotic cells. Remember, they have a nucleus and cell organelles. We put them, eukaryotic cells are underneath the domain eukarya, and there are four, as of right now, kingdoms underneath the domain eukarya. Fungus kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and then the protus kingdom. This little chart here, again, if you want to take some time and look at it, what it does is it talks about here in the first level the cell types, and again you'll notice eukarya, eukaryotic cells, bacteria, archaea are prokaryotic cells, no nucleus. There's that cell structure right there, peptidoglycan in the cell wall, no peptidoglycan for Archaeobacteria. Unicellular, autotrophic and heterotrophic, and some examples of each one of Archaeobacteria, again, are the X games, live in extreme environments. Bacteria is what we know that makes us sick and help break down into smaller things. And again, protists, here's some examples. Multicellular, there's a huge diversity here. Both traits, autotrophic, heterotrophic, and some examples. Fungus, eukaryotic cells, that cell wall made of chitin or chitin, again. Most are multicellular, some are unicellular. Heterotrophic, remember they secrete digestive enzymes and reabsorb it. And there's some names of the common ones. Plants are eukaryotic cells. Their cell wall is composed of this stuff called cellulose, and they have an organelle called chloroplast for the most part. Multicellular, autotrophic, they make their own food. And again, some examples. And then finally, eukaryotic cells, they will not have cell walls. They only have a cell membrane. And they will not have chloroplasts. Multicellular, have to go out and find food. And again, some of the examples of that. And I hope that helps with chapter 18-3. Thanks.